Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Megillah Daf Vez begins with the first Mishnah, which discusses the 5 days on which the Megillah might possibly be read. And now there are 2 different concepts which may move the day of Megillah reading. One is that a small village is allowed to read early in order to be able to access someone who knows how to read. They're allowed to change the day in which they read the Megillah. The Gemara will ask, how do we know that? What is the source for that in the Megillah? And how do we know which days they're allowed to move it to? The other is the fact that the walled cities and the unwalled cities read the Megillah on different days. The Gemara will discuss what the source for that is, and whether that is fully agreed, and also how do we establish what is called a walled city? What is the definition of walled? We'll have 2 different versions of that and a machlokas. We'll also have a machlokas as to whether or not everyone agrees to this concept that the villages are allowed to change the day in which they read. So the Gemara begins, the Mishnah begins, that is, the Mishnah says that the Megillah can be read on any of 5 days from the 11th of Adar through the 15th of Adar. So it can be read on day 11, 12, 13, 14, or 15 of Adar. And the Gemara says it cannot be read any later or any earlier under any circumstance. Now again, this is an application of the 2 ideas. We have 3 types of places as far as these halachos are concerned. A big walled city reads on the 15th of Adar unless that's a Shabbos, in which case they will read earlier. A unwalled city, which is a large city, they'll read on the 14th of Adar, unless it's a Shabbos, in which case they'll read earlier. And a small village will read on the 14th, because it's also unwalled, unless it's not a Monday or a Thursday. And the reason for that is that the small villages didn't have anybody who knew how to read, but the people of the villages had to travel to the big cities for market day or to meet the Beis Din anyway on Mondays and Thursdays, and therefore Chazal made it convenient for them to hear the Megillah on Mondays and Thursdays. So they will go back, they will lean the Megillah earlier, all the way back as far as the 11th of Adar, depending on what day the 14th of Adar falls, what day of the week the 14th of Adar falls. So the Mishnah goes through the list of how Purim could fall out in the week, and which day the 3 zones, the small villages, the big unwalled cities, and the walled cities, when will they end up reading the Megillah? So the Mishnah works through each one. It says, if Purim, if Yud Dalet Adar falls on a Monday, so then the small villages will read that day, the big cities will read that day, and the walled cities will read the next day as usual. If it falls on a Tuesday or on a Wednesday, so then as usual, the big cities remain unchanged, whether walled or unwalled. The small villages will read earlier on the preceding Monday, and therefore they'll go to day 13 or day 12 of Adar. Now, if Purim falls on a Thursday, then what happens is that everybody reads in the right day. Small villages and big unwalled cities on the 14th, and big cities with a wall on the 15th. Now, if Purim falls on a Shabbos, on an Erev Shabbos, on a Friday, so then the small villages will read the day earlier, the preceding day, which is Thursday. Big cities without a wall will read on that Erev Shabbos. Walled cities will also read on that Erev Shabbos because they don't want to read the next day, which is on Shabbos. We don't read the Megillah on Shabbos, as we shall see later in the Masechta. Now, if Purim falls on a Shabbos, then the villages will go back to Thursday, the big cities will go back to Friday, and the walled cities will go to the next day, which is on Sunday, because that's the day they're supposed to read anyway. If Purim falls on a Sunday, then you'll have the small villages will go all the way back to the preceding Thursday, and therefore it'll be on day 11, on the 11th of Adar, while the walled cities will read on Sunday, and the unwalled cities will read on Sunday, and the walled cities will read on Monday, which is the day that follows. And now the Gemara asks, what is the source of this halacha that the Megillah can be read on all the way back to day 11? So the Gemara asks, what do you mean, what's the source? The source is because, like we said, we need to find time where the people of the small villages are able to find somebody who can read. So the Gemara says, no, that's not what we're asking. We're asking that there has to be a source for it. The Chachamim wouldn't be allowed to make up the halacha themselves. The reading of the Megillah was instituted by the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, and the rule is that if a large Beis Din makes a certain takana, no one is allowed to change that takana unless they're as great in chachma, in wisdom, and in a number, and therefore nobody could ever change the rule made by the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. So they must have built this in to the original declaration of creating Megillah reading. So where do you find that in the Megillah? The Anshe Knesset Hagdolah were the people who were around at the time of the Megillah, so this should be hinted in the Megillah itself. So the Umar says, okay, it is hinted in the Megillah itself. It's hinted in the pasuk that says, "L'kayem esimei apar ma'ila bizmanehem." What does it bizmanehem in their times? You don't need that word there. So the Umar says that is to show you that there's multiple times. It can be read on various different days. The Umar says, what do you mean? I need this to tell me that it can be read sometimes on the 14th, sometimes on the 15th. That's to tell me the halacha that walled cities and unwalled cities have different days in which they're supposed to read. How do I know about going back to day 11, 12, and 13 for the small villages? Because it's not the market day, it's not the day that they're in the town anyway. So the Gemara says no. If it was just to tell me that they can read on the 14th and the 15th, then it should just say bizman. Why does it have to say bizman ehem? That's an extra phrase. The Gemara says no, I still need that. I need it to tell me that the people are supposed to read on the 14th can't read on the 15th, and the people supposed to read on the 15th can't switch to the 14th. It's not an optional, it's not a choice. Each one has the right time which they're supposed to read. That's why they have Zman Ehem. So Umar says if that would be true, it could just say Zmanam. The extra Yud and Hey of Zman Ehem, that's an extra halacha, and that teaches me that there is another variation here, which is that you could go back to day 11, 12, or 13. So Gemara says, but you only see from this 2 extra days. You have the extra Yud and the extra Hey. Where do you see 3 extra days? The Gemara says no, because the day 13. So for this we have 2 answers. The first answer is that for day 13 you don't need any pasuk at all. The reason that there's a day 14 and day 15 is because the war which Klal Yisrael had with their enemies took place on day 13. Everybody fought on day 13, and therefore they celebrated the next day, which was day 14. Then in Shushan, they had an additional war on day 14 and celebrated on day 15. But everybody definitely had a war on day 13, and therefore day 13 is the primary celebration day. And certainly they'll be able to read the Megillah on day 13. You don't need a pasuk for that. So the extra psukim, the extra 2 days, which we will learn from the word Bizmanehem, goes earlier than that to teach me day 11 and day 12. So Gemara says, how do you know it's day 11, day 12 that are before? Maybe it should be day 16 and 17, which are after. So Gemara answers no, because it says v'lo yavar, you can't pass by. Lo yavar literally means it shouldn't pass on, it shouldn't change. We should always have these halachos every year, but it also means not to pass, that you can't make it later, you only make it earlier. Now the Gemara gives a second source for the fact that you need to have 2 days, day 11 and 12. So Gemara says because it says kayomim. Kayomim means like the days. I mean, every year that we should have additional 2 days that are like the 2 days which we had explicitly. So explicit days are day 14 and 15. You should have 2 additional days, and therefore you should have day 11 and 12. Not day 13, because like we said, you don't need a pasuk for that. And not day 16 and 17, because that's after, and you only go earlier, you don't go later. Right, now the Gemara presents that not everybody agrees to this halacha that the small villages are allowed to lane earlier. So Gemara says it may be limited by a machlokes and by an additional factor. So the limitation here is expressed by Rabbi Bar Bachan, the name of Yochanan. There's 2 different versions as to what he says. First version is that he says it's actually a machlokes. Rabbi Akiva says you can change the day for the small villages, and the Chachamim say you can't. So one says you can always change the day. One says you can never change the day. So the Gemara says there's a price that says that Rabbi Yehuda holds that sometimes you change the day and sometimes you don't, which is as follows: in the days of the Beis Hamikdash, when that is the second Beis Hamikdash, which is after the Purim story, when they were Mekadesh the Chodesh by seeing the moon, and they were able to send messages, and everybody understood when the Tikkun Chodesh was. You didn't have to worry by when the Yom Tov of Pesach would be, because we got the messengers out. Then there was no problem with what day the Megillah would be read. Everybody knew when Pesach would be. One had nothing to do with the other. Then it would be okay to lay the Megillah on a different day than the normal Purim. However, in later times, when Klal Yisrael's messenger system didn't work well, and people would learn out when Pesach was by seeing when the Megillah was read, that we had to disband this idea of laying the Megillah on a different day. It had to be done on day 14 or 15, because otherwise people would learn the wrong halacha. They would count wrongly to when Pesach was meant to be. The messenger system didn't function. So Gemara says, so that's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. Now, according to what Rabbi Yochanan said, that's a machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim. whether there is a day 11, 12, 13, or there's never day 11, 12, 13. So Rabbi Yehuda doesn't fit with either of them, because he says sometimes there isn't, sometimes there isn't. Depends what era you're referring to. He doesn't fit with anybody. So therefore, that's a kasha on Rabbi Yochanan, because he can't be there. Rabbi Yehuda fits with no one. Now, the Gemara's other version of this whole conversation is that the way Rabbi Yochanan first expressed it was that Rabbi Akiva says you can always have a variation go back to day 11, 12, or 13. And the Chachamim say sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. Depends on whether the messenger system was up and running or not. According to that, this brisa of Rabbi Yehuda supports this statement, because it shows that Rabbi Yehuda must be saying, like somebody must be saying like the Chachamim who disagree with Rabbi Akiva, who's the author of our Mishnah, who says that you can always have this 11 day, that this day 11, 12, or 13, you never have to worry about the messenger system falling apart. Okay, now, having brought down Rabbi Yehuda, the Gemara knows that there's another brisa that contradicts this Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda here says it depends on the era. You have to have the messenger system to be up and running in order to have this. The Gemara has a different brisa in which Rabbi Yehuda says that this halacha of going back to day 11, 12, and 13 only applies to a place where there's a big city around that people went to on the Monday and Thursday for the market day or for the Beis Din. Now, he does not qualify that it depends on the era. He just says it depends on the place. And that would seem to imply that here Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold that it makes a difference which era you are and whether the messenger system works or not. So that contradicts Rabbi Yehuda, which we brought down earlier. And says Rav Ashi asked the kasha, and he said, therefore, it's not Rabbi Yehuda who said this brisa, it's Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehuda. So says, just because you have a kasha doesn't give you right to change the author. You can't say it's Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehuda. It says Rabbi Yehuda, doesn't say Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehuda. So says, no, Rav Ashi had heard different versions as to whether our brisa was Rabbi Yehuda or Rabbi Yosi. Rabbi Yehuda, and based on the other brisa, which shows what Rabbi Yehuda's opinion holds, which is different, he changed this one and said, obviously, the authoritative version is the one that says Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehuda, not the one that says Rabbi Yehuda. Otherwise, you'd have a contradiction to deal with. Okay, now the Gemara moves on to the halacha that there's a different day of Megillah reading for the walled cities as opposed to the unwalled cities. The Gemara wants to know, what is the source of this? Where do you see that there's a different day for each of them? So the Gemara says, well, it's pretty straightforward. The pasuk says, Al kan Yehudim haprazim hayoshim ba'ari haprazos osimis yomar ba'asar l'chodesh adar simcha mishtav yom tov mishlach manos ish l're'eh. It says only the prazim, only the unwalled areas, the spread out areas, they're the ones who made Purim on the 14th. Obviously, everybody else made Purim on the same day as Shushan, which was the 15th, because we know clearly Shushan made Purim on the 15th of Adar, like it says in the Megillah. So Gemara says, well, how do you know that you see from here that the walled cities did something different, but you don't see that they made Purim on the 15th? Maybe they didn't have Purim at all. Maybe you had the unwalled cities, like it says, had it on the 14th. Shushan had it on the 15th, and other walled cities didn't have Purim. Gemara says, why would I think they didn't have Purim? It says that Kol Yisrael. It says Kol Yisrael. Everybody had Purim, and it also says that it applied to all of Achashverosh's 127 countries. So obviously everybody had it. So why would I think that's not a viable option? So the Gemara says, okay, well maybe there's a different option. Maybe the prazim, that's the open areas, had it on the 14th. Shushan had it on the 15th. The walled cities had an option. They had a choice. They could choose 14 or 15. Like it says in the pasuk describing further, it says, Lias osem es yom arba asar l'chodesh adar ve'es yom chamisha asar b'chol shana v'shana. Make day 14 and day 15. So maybe that's referring to the walled cities, and it says day 14 or day 15. Someone says, if it would have said Yom Arba Asar V'Chamisha Asar, day 14 and 15, I would accept that. They can choose either one, but it doesn't say that. It says S. It says Lios Osem Es Yom Arba Asar L'Chodesh Adar V'Es Yom Chamisha Asar B'Chol Shana V'Shana. That V'Es divides into two. It has to be one or the other. They have to be 14 or 15. They can't have a choice. So Gemara says, okay, well maybe I'll say that it says as follows. Maybe the unwalled areas, the prazim had day 14, and the unwalled cities could pick either one. And before we want to say that they had both of them. Now we're saying that they can only have one, but maybe they get to choose whichever one they want. So Gemara says no, because it says bisman ehem, that each one had their own individual time. They couldn't swap and switch. Each one had their assigned time. That's what zman ehem means. So Gemara says, okay, maybe their time was on day 13. How do you know that it was on day 15? Umar says, well, no, because it should be like Shushan. Shushan, it says, clearly was day 15. The point of the walled city is to be different than the Prazim, is that it should be like Shushan. Therefore, it's going to be the same as Shushan, which was on day 15. Umar says, okay, all this tells me about the mitzvah of Mishnah v'Simcha, Mashlach Manos, which are discussed in these psukim. Where do you see that reading the Megillah should also be on that time? The Umar answers, there's a hekesh, there's a connection between making the Mishnah v'Simcha, making the extra Suda, and the reading of the Megillah, because the pasuk says in the Megillah, Vayamim ha'ila niskarim v'nasim. Nizkarim refers to reading the Megillah, Nasim refers to making the Yom Tov. So those two things go together. Whichever day you have one, you have the other. Okay, all good. The Gemara says, but now let's discuss when exactly is the determination of a walled city. When we say walled city, what do we mean? So our Mishnah had said a walled city from the days of Yeshua ben Nun. The Gemara says that does not agree with Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha, who says that the definition of a walled city is a city which has been walled since the days of Achashverosh. What's the source of these two opinions? So Gemara says Yeshua ben Karcha's opinion, because it says Achashverosh, because you're connecting walled cities to Shushan. A walled city is meant to be like Shushan. Shushan, we know, had a wall around it from the days of Achashverosh. Earlier than that, we don't know. We don't know that they had a wall in the days of Yeshua ben Nun. We don't know anything about that. We just know Achashverosh. So therefore, the source is Shushan, and therefore the definition of walled city will be like Shushan, and going back to Achashverosh. Now, the other opinion, which is our Mishnah, says it's learned out of a pasuk which uses the word prazi in Chumash Devarim. It says Levad me'ari haprazi harbim od. Over there, the word prazi means a day which refers to a city which is unwalled at that time. That time was the time of Yeshua ben Nun. That was when Klal Yisrael was entering Eretz Yisrael. And over there, we define prazi by what was walled and unwalled there. So too here, we're going to define prazi by what is walled and unwalled at that time, which is the time of Yeshua ben Nun. So now the Gemara says, okay, why do they each not hold of the other's opinions? The Gemara says, well, Shub and Karcha, I understand, doesn't hold of this Gzeir Shava of Prazi. Prazi doesn't learn out of there. What is our Mishnah? Why does he not say like Yeshua ben Karcha, who says that it's learned from Shushan and it should be like it was in the times of Achashverosh? This is what I mean, because he has the Gzeir Shava Prazi. That's why he doesn't learn that way. But no, that's not what I'm asking. What I'm asking is, where does Shushan fit? According to him, Shushan is not a prazi, and Shushan is not a walled city either. It's not prazim because it has a wall around it, and it's clearly separated from prazim by the Megillah. It doesn't have the same halachos as prazim. On the other hand, it doesn't qualify as a walled city because it doesn't have a wall from the days of Yeshua ben Nun. So where will Shushan fit? So Umar says, no, Shushan's not a problem. Shushan has its own halacha explicitly discussed in the Megillah. The Megillah says it has Purim on day 15. That's not a kasha at all. So now the Gemara says, if you look carefully in the Psukim, we have another issue. It seems to say that there are two differentiations between the regions as to how Purim is defined. It talks about B'chol Medina Medina, that's separating one Medina from another, and talks about B'chol Ir V'ir, separating one city from another. That implies that there are three different categories, two separations between regions, and therefore three different types of regions. And that would make sense according to the Tana of our Mishnah, because you have some places which are prazim. You have Shushan, which is not prazim, but it's not walled from the days of Yeshua ben Nun. And then you have the third category, which is cities which are walled in the days of Yeshua ben Nun. However, according to Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha, you only have two categories, because Shushan and Mukafin, Shushan is considered like a walled city. It's the same as everything else. So where it says, Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha is not bothered by this. He says, according to you, your Tana, this doesn't really make sense anyway, because you don't need two separations. The Mishnah the Psukim explicitly define Shushan as being different. You don't have to tell me Medina is different than Medina and Ir is different than Ir. You only need one separation for it. So the extra phrase here, the extra Medina and Ir, if Ir is to teach me another halacha, which is that a region around the walled city, which is Samach V'nir, it's close to the city and can see the city, has the same halachos as that city itself. Umar says, what is the definition of this region, this suburban area that surrounds the city? So Umar says that Rav Yirmiyah, the name of Rav Yirmiyah, or possibly Rav Chia bar Abba, said in the name Rav Yirmiyah, or possibly Rav Chia bar Abba said, not in anyone's name, that this is the distance from Chamzon to Tveria, which is a mil. Umar says, so just tell me a mil. Why do you tell me Chamzon to Tveria? He says, no, the reason I'm telling you that is to tell you how far a mil is. You need to know how far a mil is. Maybe you don't know what a mil is. A mil is the distance from Chamzon to Tveria, and that is within a mil of a walled city, has the halacha of that walled city itself.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.